Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf yayin, reminding everyone to please register for the Siyum of Avodah Zarah. We're very excited. Terry, we can't wait to finish Shas with you. And we have a really nice program lined up. So it's on Zoom on September 2nd. And like I said yesterday, also we're having a big Siyum Seder Nizikin, both on Zoom on September 14th. And for those in Israel, we're having an event on September 15th. In Jerusalem. It'll be a live event in Hebrew. We hope that many of you will be able to join. Nice way to celebrate ending Seder Nizikin. And also, by the way, it's the week before Rosh Hashanah, and the whole topic of Horayot is mistakes and shkaga, and it's all related, so it'll be a really good also entry into Rosh Hashanah. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. I'm a Rava. Oh, and by the way, it started going out yesterday on the social media campaign, but just to tell everyone, we have a new website being launched, and it's launching next week, Bezrat Hashem. So stay tuned, and be a very exciting new change in how to learn with Hadran. Okay, Amar Rava. Starting at the bottom of Samach Tenamabet. Today, Rava, for the first half of today's daf, is going to be the central character. The way it's going to work, we're going to first see this law that he makes this distinction about a prostitute and a person and kind of the relationship. Are we worried about yayin nesech or not? Today's going to be all in what situations are we worried that the idolater came in contact with the wine, offered as a libation or not. And we're going to see a slew of 9 cases that Rava ruled in, and then 2 more cases of other rabbis. And you're going to see that in general, there seems to be, at least in Rava and maybe in these other 2 cases, an agenda to try to be lenient here. Okay? But I don't know if it's particularly an agenda to be lenient or it just happened he was lenient in these cases. The questions that are going to rise are we concerned that if the idolater touched the wine, offered as a libation? Are we not worried? What's going through the idolater's mind? Okay, are they worried someone's going to catch them? In which case, they're not going to do something. Are they, and we're going to see all different kinds of considerations that come up. So, Amar Rava, Zonat Goya v'Yisrael mesubin etzla. Cham Rashari. Okay, again, every time we have this word Goya or Oved Kochavim, it depends what year you're looking at. I happen to just be reading from the Gemara in front of me, but there are all different versions. So we have a prostitute who's not Jewish. And we have a Jew, okay, she's an idolater likely. We have a Jew who's eating with her. Okay? Now, Cham Rashari, is that wine going to be forbidden? Now, here's a very interesting logic. When the person goes to this prostitute, obviously he's not a fully committed Jew keeping to all the halachot. Okay, he's with a prostitute and a non-Jewish prostitute, but that's not the issue. He's with a prostitute. What's he doing with the prostitute? Well, the Gemara says we can still permit the wine, and we're not worried. We assume he's very careful about yayin nesech. Okay, this is an interesting thing, an interesting comment about people. Now, he might have a strong sexual desire, and because of that, he ended up with this prostitute. But yitra de yayin nesech lo takifluhu. But it's not like he has this huge desire to drink yayin nesech. In other words, that he keeps those halachot, okay? Because that's not considered something he's so strongly desiring that, that he'll be not really careful, like he wants her to do a libation on the wine. That's not something there's any desire about. And because of that, we don't suspect that the wine was tampered with. We assume that he kept those laws, and therefore, even though he was eating with her, he must have been careful that she didn't do any libations to the wine. That's the first case. Second case is the reverse. Zona Yisraelit v'ovdei kochavim mesubin. If the prostitute is a Jewish woman and the people that are eating with her are idolaters, chamra asir, then the wine's going to be forbidden, because what's the nature of the relationship between a man who goes to a prostitute and the prostitute? My time, ho'il v'zila alayhu is an unfortunate reality, but he looks upon her like she's a prostitute. And because of that, Batrayu Garira, he has the upper hand in the relationship. So if he wants to come in contact with the wine, he's going to do that. She's not going to be able to stop him. It's not the nature of a relationship between a prostitute and someone who comes to her. And therefore, we have to be concerned that the wine is yayin nesech. Okay, now, that he could have done a libation. And I want to go back to the first case for a minute, and I want to quote you a very interesting source, okay? Just have to open it. Sorry. I should have opened it before class. Give me a second. So the Taz, if we go back to this first case about someone who is, right, there's also this, maybe I didn't really stress this enough, but in this concept of he doesn't have a desire for yayin nesech, it also seems to imply that people are very careful about laws of yayin nesech. And therefore, even though he's going to a prostitute, for sure he's keeping laws of yayin nesech, because that's important. Just like you might say, he's not going to eat her non-kosher food, he's not going to allow her to libate the wine. But the Taz, much, much later, in Achron, who's a super commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, he says that basically this reason, that he brings, he says it's obvious because in the times of the Gemara, they were much more careful about yayin nesech. And nowadays, people are not so careful about what we call stam yainam, if we don't know. And he says, because people are not so careful about it now, for sure, if there's someone who goes to a prostitute and there's wine there, we're not going to be able to make that same assumption that for sure he's careful about yayin nesech, and therefore we should forbid the wine. So the Taz basically says that based on reality of our times, this is already a different situation, which is very interesting, right? Because it's, again, right, because what are we doing here? This is all in today's daf in general is about human behavior. And what's the expectation of human behavior? A person goes to a prostitute, we assume they do other things. And that might change over time. And therefore he changes the halacha here and says, in this case, I would forbid it. Okay, next. So now we're going to start. This wasn't a particular case. This was a law. If this were to happen, if that were to happen. Now we're going to start our slew of actual cases that happen. That came before, the first 9 of them come before Rava, and Rava rules on them, and you're going to see in many of them he's lenient. Hahu beita, davayate bechamer di Yisrael. There was a house with wine of a Jew inside. Some people say there was wine of a Jew and a non-Jew. It's unclear, but it's not such an important, there's some ramifications, but for our purposes, we're going to just leave that issue aside. Al ovei kochavim. So in comes this idolater, right? That's why it's interesting whether maybe the idolater had rights to be there because his wine was there as well. It's not clear if it was the Jew's house. A lot of details aren't so clear here. But the idolater walks in, and then he locks the door behind him. So now when you lock a door, right, you can do whatever you want. No one can come in. Now, how long does it take to do a libation on wine? Not a very long time. So theoretically, you would think that this would be forbidden. But there was a crack in the door that people could see through, almost like a peephole that goes 2 ways. Okay? Now somebody looked in and saw the idolater going in between the barrels of wine. So Rava says, anything that someone potentially could have seen that's in the periphery, that's in actually the direct vision of this crack. So if you could see through the crack and you can see, we would obviously assume, right, here's the crack, everything in front of it would be fine. Everything opposite the hole. Everything on the sides is actually going to be forbidden because there no one could have seen. So even if nobody saw, the point is, now this is why we go into the head of this idolater. The idolater goes in, maybe wants to do a libation, but they say, people can see me over here, right? He locks the door. Obviously, he doesn't want people to see what he's doing, but people can see through the crack. So if people could see there's a concern someone might see, and he's certainly not going to touch those. But the ones on the sides, very likely he will, and therefore they're all forbidden. Case 2. They had a lot of 2-story houses there, the two levels. The bottom level, in this case, was owned by an idolater. The top level was owned by the Jew. Now, the Jew, they leave out these details, but the commentaries fill them in. The Jew left their wine downstairs, but they could see from upstairs, they could keep their eye on the wine. And that's how they knew the idolater never touched their wine. I'm guessing also, as heat rises, they probably didn't, right? People always put it in the cellar. I guess they didn't have a cellar maybe, and they just kept it on the lower floor, so it wouldn't get ruined. But now, one day, Sham'u Kal Tigra, they heard a big fight outside. Now, what do you do when you hear some commotion outside? Everybody goes outside. So Nafke, they both went outside. Now you have to assume, again, there's some details missing here, but from the end of the story, you're going to see that they didn't really see each other. They weren't right near each other, but they knew they both ran outside. And then what happens after is a little unclear. So according to what the idolater thinks is that kadim ato ve'kochavim. So first, the idolater goes back into the house. Okay, the commotion is ending or he gets bored watching the commotion, he goes back into the house, and he locks the door. Okay, so now if the Jew's outside, he won't be able to get in very quickly because the door is locked. So the idolater could do what they want, and then they'll, till the door gets unlocked and all that, he'll be done. However, Rava Chamar Shari. Rava permits the wine. Meimar Amar ki hechid kadim atay ana kadim at Yisrael v'yate b'Elyona v'kachazeli. He says, listen, it could be, I think I came in first, but theoretically, he might have already gone in already, and he might even be upstairs. So because of that, he might see, if he's upstairs already, he'll see what I'm doing. So basically, he doesn't know if the person's gone upstairs or not. So that's why it must be they didn't see each other outside. He's pretty sure he came in first, but there's a chance that he didn't come in first. In the same way he decides to come in, maybe the other guy decides to come in, and therefore I have to worry. Okay? And again, if there's this concern in the idolater's head that somebody might see them, it's a problem. Although we're going to have to fine-tune this in some of the later stories. Ha'u ushpiza, case 3. There was a case in an inn, Tahava yate bechamer di Yisrael. There was wine of a Jew. And ishtakach ove kochavim david yate beidani. And then they see this idolater in between the barrels. They say Yativ is sitting. Okay, he was sitting among the barrels. Amarava im nitpas alav keganav shari v'im lo asir. So Rava says, if he's nitpas alav keganav, if it's a place, there's a bunch of different interpretations. The Steinsaltz that you'll see in the corner is a totally different interpretation, but I'm not going with that one. Most of the commentaries go along these lines, although also have differences of opinion within that. But if the authorities would catch him and say, you're a thief, you're in a place where you're not supposed to be, and you're among these barrels that, right, if he were to have touched them and opened them, they would bring him to jail as a thief, then it's permitted. Because why? Because obviously then he's not going to touch them, because nobody wants to get caught. V'ilo, but if nobody cares, and he has free reign to do whatever he wants there, then usher, then we assume he likely opened them and offered them as a libation. Case 4. Ha'u beita d'yavayatu bechamra, we have a house where there's wine. Ishtakach oved kochavim d'avakayim beidane. In this case, we see, again, by the way, I didn't mention this, but you can start paying attention to this if you want. There's threads of literary wording that connects stories, like we have the Achta Dedasha Ba'ape, lock the door, and then lock the door was in the second case. We have Kai Beidane, Yativ Beidane, right? One is standing among the barrels, sitting among the barrels. There's a lot of language that kind of flows from story to story. You can start paying attention if you want. It's just a side point. I think it helps with understanding the order in which they, sometimes they ordered the stories because of the connection of the words. So we have this case. Rava says, the Oved Kochavim was standing among the barrels. I don't think there's a difference standing or sitting, but he was standing among the barrels. Amarava itle l'ishtemute chamra asir. V'lo chamra shari. This is a new thing Rava adds. If he can explain himself and he has a good excuse as to what he's doing there. Now, remember the previous. The previous said if they could catch him as a thief. Now, if you get caught as a thief, but you'll say, oh, but I was there because so-and-so asked me to come and check on something. Or if you have a good reason up your sleeve that you can explain yourself, then you're not worried about getting caught. If you're not worried about getting caught, then you're back to the case before, which said, oh, if not, it's going to be forbidden because the person feels very comfortable doing what they want. But if you don't have any excuse and they catch you, then chamra shari. Then the wine's going to be permitted because the assumption is people don't want to get caught. And therefore, they're not going to start tampering with anything because if they do, they're going to get caught and they don't want to go to jail or get in trouble or have to pay. So they'll watch themselves and they won't do it. So again, these are all different factors that contribute to what they, right? Are they concerned someone's going to see them and know that they did it? Are they concerned that they're going to get caught? Okay, that's the issue. Are they concerned the Jew's already there, right? All kinds of issues. Next, they're all really part of the same thing. Now, before we get to the next story, there's a difficulty they're going to raise on this one. Meitive, but wait, there's a source that seems to say otherwise. Nin ala pundak, if the door to the inn was locked and the idolater was in there, Osha Amar Lo Shmol, or the Jew said, listen, I want you to watch my inn for a little while. Rashi says, outside, like stand outside and watch it. I'm going for a while. That's like the case in the Mishnah we saw yesterday, right? I'm going for a while. Then, right, it's a sul, because then the idolater feels very comfortable doing what they want. Number one, they're locked inside, no one's there, or they were given the key and told, like, watch this for me, I won't be back for a while. Then, of course, they feel very comfortable doing what they want. But here, notice, my lav afagav de leitle lishtamute. Now, this is even if I give you the key and say, I'll be back in a while, but someone were to catch them inside, right? They wouldn't have an excuse as to what they were doing inside. Then it sounds like it's still going to be forbidden. And we just said, if they have no excuse and no explanation as to why, or just because I said, just because they lock the door doesn't mean they can't get caught by someone. If someone were to get in and say, what are you doing here? And they don't have a good excuse. So it sounds like even if they don't have an excuse, they're still likely to tamper with it. And we just said if they could get caught, right? This Braita makes no distinction whatsoever. And we would have expected this distinction to be here if Rava was right. To which the Gemara says, it didn't say so, but it obviously meant that. Lo, b'di leilish demute. It's only when they can give a good excuse as to what they're doing there and can explain their actions. Otherwise, we're going to be worried. So even though the Braita doesn't say it, we assume the Braita means that. Okay. Story 5. Here we have a Jew and idolater sitting drinking wine together. Shama Yisrael kal tziluye beiknishta. Okay, now first of all, they're sitting having wine, but the Jew has his wine, the idolater's not getting into the Jew's wine. But then, all of a sudden, Jew hears them davening nearby. What does a good Jew do? Kam v'azil, he says, I'm going to daven mincha. Okay? Whatever tefillah it might be. Rava chamar shari. Rava says, wine is fine. Now this sounds strange, right? How long does it take to offer a libation? Very quick. How long does it take to daven, let's say the shortest tefillah mincha? A few minutes. So the idolater has plenty of time to offer the wine up as a libation. So why would Rava permit the wine? So here's an interesting answer. Meimar Amar, the idolater will say, Hashta mitkale lechamra v'hadar ate. While the Jew's davening, they're going to remember, oh no, I left my wine. Now, do you have to think about what this, right? What the idolater's thinking, the Jew is thinking, right? So he hears the call to prayer, gets up, runs out to daven, forgets momentarily about the wine. All of a sudden, in the middle of davening, remembers, I left my wine. And with this idolater, the idolater obviously knows these halachot, it seems like. And therefore, he's worried, the idolater says, it's very likely he's going to come right back. He doesn't want to lose his wine. His wine is more important to him than prayer. And therefore, he's worried that at any moment, the Jew might show up and it's a problem. Okay, believable or not, I don't know, but wait till you get to the next story. So now we have a Jew and an idolater on a boat. Shama Yisrael kal shipurei de beis shimshei. So he hears the shofarot of Bein Hashmashot, which they would sound the shofarot on Erev Shabbat. The Shabbat is starting. Nafit Basil, he goes out of the boat. Right, must be a boat that was docked. He goes off the boat to celebrate Shabbat. Now, you can figure he's not coming back for 25 hours, and the idolater must know that. Va'amar Rava chamra shari. Rava says wine is permitted. Meimar Amar, why? The idolater will say, Hashta mitkale lechamra v'hadar ate. He's going to all of a sudden remember that he left all this wine, and he's going to come back for it, even on Shabbat. Now, imishum Shabbat. Now, if you say, what about Shabbat? Just because it's Shabbat, he's not going to come back on the boat on Shabbat. Now, here's some girsa issues, whether it was Rava who said this or not, but we'll read it like this. Ha'amar Rava, didn't Rava say, Amrli Isur Giora. Now, Isur Giora is going to talk about something he thought before he converted. He was a convert. That's why he's called Isur Giora. Isur is his name. Giora means the ger. And he's going to tell of what he thought before he converted, which is basically what we want for our sugya, which is what the non-Jews think about the Jews. Okay? It's not important what the reality is. It's important what they think. That's all we're talking about today. What's going on in this non-Jew's head. So they say, if it's Mishum Shabbat, he doesn't think the Jew, he thinks, let's put it this way, I'll already tell you, he thinks that a Jew cares more about their money than they do about keeping Shabbat. And this is what Yisro Giora thought before he converted. Once he converted, he realized that's not true, and we'll see why. But the important part for our sugya right now is what he thought before he converted. So Rava says that Yisro Giora told me, Ki avinam ba'ar miyutan, Aramai, we talked recently, the kfela Aramai. Aramai means a non-Jewish person, Aramean. So when I was not a Jew, Amrina, and I said, Yehudai lo mintre Shabta. The Jews aren't so careful about keeping Shabbat. Now, what's his proof? Because if they kept Shabbat, I would have found tons of wallets in the shuk, particularly on Friday late in the day, because all the Jews who got stuck and didn't make it home in time and have their wallets in their pockets and now can't carry them because there's no Eruv and they can't get them home, and also it's money and you're not allowed to be carrying money, it's muktzah. It's really the carrying issue that they're talking about here. I would have found they would have left them in the shuk because they can't carry them home. And the fact that I don't see all these wallets in the shuk must be proof that the Jews are carrying their wallets home. They care too much about their money to leave it in the shuk. V'lo yadana, but what I didn't realize, now that's already what we needed, which is what he thought. He thought that the Jews care more about their money than about keeping Shabbat. So therefore, when this Jew realizes that they left all their wine on the boat with this idolater, they're going to clearly come back, and even on Shabbat. So now he says, what didn't I know though? Then I now know, now that I'm Jewish, or it could be hamotzi kis b'Shabbat. There's a bunch of different girsaot here about what the situation is. Is it someone who finds a wallet in the shuk? Likely it's more like someone who finds their own wallet in their pocket in the shuk and they realize they walked out carrying their wallet, or they didn't make it home in time for Shabbat. What do? There's a solution. The rabbis come up with a solution here. The problem by Torah law is to carry something 4 cubits. So if you carry it less than 4 cubits and stop, and then less than 4 cubits and stop, and less than 4 cubits and stop, that's a solution the rabbis came up with for people to get their wallets home. So then I realized that we were keeping Shabbat, and still there were no wallets in the shuk. Next case, 7. Hahu aryeh havanayim b'ma'atzata. So there was a lion all of a sudden heard roaring in this in the wine press. Shama ovei kochavim. Now it was a wine press of a Jew. So this idolater hears the lion and gets super scared. And what does he do? The best thing to do if you're in a wine press is tasha bene dane. So he runs away and hides between the barrels. Rava chamar shari. Rava says we don't have to worry about the wine. I would have said we don't have to worry about the wine because he's scared about the lion and he's not starting to think about libating wine, but that's not what Gemara says. Meimar Amar, the idolater says, Ki hechi tashina ana, just like I hid, itchinami Yisrael chorai v'kachazele. Likely there's other Jews around here. I'm in a wine press of a Jew. There's probably another Jew around who's going to come running here. They'll see me. And again, this concern, they'll only do it if no one can see them. Right? That's the whole thing with locking the door and all that. No one can see them, it's not a problem. But if no one can see them, it's specifically a problem. Here, it's likely that someone might see them, so they don't touch the wine. Case 8. Hanu ganve desalke lepumbedita. There were thieves who came to Pumbedita, patchu chaviyata tuva, and they opened a lot of barrels. Okay, we're going to see this later. They don't say it here, but later they're going to talk about if they opened a lot of barrels, they probably weren't looking for wine because they opened way too many more barrels than they were planning to drink. Okay, that's also an issue. Now, there was already a question here because why would they, if you want to drink wine and then maybe offer libation, but you're not going to open tons of barrels. So now, Amarava Chamar Shari, my timer. You're not going to like this answer, but Ruva Ganve Yisrael Ninu. Okay, we start with the Jewish prostitutes. We end up here with the Jewish thieves. There's a lot of Jewish thieves in Pumbedita. And because of that, chances are, this is Dine Rov, we go by the majority. Since the majority are Jews, there's nothing to worry about at all. Because so it's not even an issue. You don't even have to get to, did they libate the wine? They're Jews. And again, just because they steal, right? They're not Ovdei Elilim. They're not idolaters who are going to start libating wine. But now we're going to see, okay, we're stopping for a minute, taking a break. We're almost at the end of the stories of Rava. We have one more, but we're taking a break in this story to say there was another story like this in the Hardea. Hava Uvda bin Hardea. Now, presumably, because they don't talk about the Rov Ganavim, maybe in the Hardea there weren't a majority of Ganavim and not in the time of Shmuel. Shmuel and Rava were different generations. Shmuel was first, Rava was fourth generation. V'amr Shmuel chamar shari. And Shmuel permitted the wine. Kiman. So the Gemara wants to know, who does he hold like? They don't think it's because of Rov Ganavim or Jews. So they say, it must be Rabbi Eliezer, Desever Safek Bi'atahor. Okay, now we're going to learn a Mishnah, Ditnan. Okay, we're going to change topics for a minute about Tum and Tara, and then we'll explain what it means, Safek Bi'atahor. I'm going to wait off on this. Hanichnas Lebik'abi Yimodak Shamim. We've seen this case before, by the way. Someone goes into a valley during the rainy months. Now, in the rainy season, in the valley, there's fields, and in the fields, everything's growing. Nobody walks there. That means that even though this valley is open and public, it's actually considered Reshut Yachid. It's considered private domain during the winter. So now, during the winter, this is private domain. You might remember, I've explained this many times, Safek Tumah, if you have a case, are we not sure if somebody became impure or not, and it's in a private domain, which this is, we're going to be stringent and say it's Tameh, the person's Tameh. If it's a fake tuma in the public domain, we actually permit. And that's all based on the sota, without getting into that today. So, the person goes into a bigan yimodak shamim, v'tum'a b'sadeh plonit. And there's impurity in one of the fields in the valley. V'amar halachti b'makom alaz. And the person now tells us, listen, I was in that place. Ve'eni yodeim nechnasti lo tasadem lo nechnasti. Okay, there was a dead body somewhere in the field. I don't know if I even went into that field. I know I went in the valley, and I know in that valley, now you told me that there's a dead body somewhere, but I don't even know if I was in that field or not. So the rabbis disagree with this, but Rabbi Eliezer holds, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Safek bi'atahol, Safek maga tameh. If the person said, I don't even know if I went into the field, then we're going to say for sure the person's pure, even though Safek Tumah in the private domain is tameh, but not here, because we don't even know if the person went into the field with the tumah. If it's safek maga, the person said, I went into the field where the dead body was, I just don't know if I happened to walk where the dead body was and come in contact with it, then we're going to be strict and say, that's safek tumah, in Reshut Yachid, we're going to be strict. But not safek bi'ah. So our case, now they're going to assume that why did Shmuel permit? Because Shmuel permitted based on safek bi'ah. We don't even know if the idolaters went there or not. We don't know who these Ganavim were. It could be their Jews, it could be their idolaters, we don't know. So that's the fake biyah. To which, and that was the Gemara saying, are we assuming that Shmuel held like Rabbi Eliezer and not like the rabbis who's actually forbid? They say that's safek tumah and you're going to have to be tameh. So they say, Shane hatam kevan. No, this is different. Even the rabbis would agree with what Shmuel said. Because kevan de'ika depatche l'shumamona havele sfeik sfeika. This is what I mentioned before. They opened a lot of barrels. And if they opened a lot of barrels, then it could be they were looking for money. Maybe people hid money in barrels. So why they opened all these barrels, right? We don't know. Maybe it was Jew, maybe Gentile. And if it was a Gentile, maybe they opened the barrel not to libate the wine, but to look for money. They were thieves after all. And therefore, it's what we call a sfeik sfeika, a double doubt. And a double doubt, we're going to be lenient. Turning now to Amud Bet. Hayi Ravita, there was a young woman, or a young girl, actually, who was a non-Jewish girl. De ishtakach de havet beidani. She was among the barrels. V'havet nikita ufya biyada. And she had some foam from the wine in her hands. Okay, that seems pretty clear. But no, Amar Rava chamar share. He says it's permitted. Amar migava de chavita shakalte. Could be she took it from the outside. Sometimes it foams up and it goes over. And it could be it's from the outside of the barrel. V'af agav de leika too. Even though, if you look at all the barrels right now, you don't see any foam on the barrels. Amar, because if you'd say, okay, well then there must be foam in some of the barrels outside, and if you don't see any, that would be weird to say, what, she had the only foam? You say, yeah, Amar itramuye tramila. It could be it just happened on one of the barrels, and she took it, and it's gone, and yeah, you can assume that. Now, there's an interesting machlok at Rashi and Tosfot here. I don't have so much time to go into it, but it's really interesting, so I want to point it out. Rashi says, this is specifically only if she's young. If she's older, it's a problem. Why? Rashi says, Dafka Ravita, de ena yodat b'tiv nisuch, v'lo masra nafsha leminga. She doesn't really understand the significance of nisuch, and she's not going to risk anything to do it. Okay? Whereas if you're older, you understand the value and you might be willing to be a little risky and do it. Tosfot says, why are you assuming just because the story was with a young girl that the halacha is only about a young girl? That just happened to be what the case was. Doesn't mean that you can start deriving this other details, right? There's the classic, the stories of the rabbis who do things and everyone thinks, oh, they did it because of, there was a reason, right? No, that's just what happened. So he says two interesting things. One is, we never see this distinction between young people and old people. They know, right? The young people don't really know the tiv nisuch, and the older people do, and he doesn't really agree with that. And he says, I think, it was just the case. However, he says, even according to Rashi, and again, this goes back to what I said about the Taz, about things changing, he also says, the very last words in Tosfot, on the first Tosfot on the Amud, Lo nafkamina midi achshav. Nowadays it doesn't matter anyway, even according to Rashi. Digdolim einam bekiim b'tiv nisuch. Like, this is how things change. He says, even the older people, the older women now, and I assume it means in general, don't really understand the value of nisuch. So it's also wouldn't be a concern at all today, even older, even according to Rashi. So that's, again, things changing. Okay, now that was our 9th story. We're finished. But now we're going to have 2 other stories that don't involve Rava. So we're still in stories. Hu Pulmasa. There was an army. Okay, the head of the army and his underlings. Deselek, or all the soldiers. Deselek l'Nehardad. They came into Nehardad. Patchu chavita tuven. They opened a lot of barrels. Ki'ata Rav Dimi Amar. When Rav Dimi came, he told us, Uvada have kamed Rabbi Elazar ushara. So he goes back and he says, there was a case with Rabbi Elazar and he permitted it. And he's trying to quote precedent from Israel. But he says, I'm not really sure what his basis was. Maybe he was like Rabbi Eliezer. We don't know who came and whether they even came or not. Whether they were, whether it was idolaters who came or they weren't. And then, by the way, it would only be Rabbi Eliezer. The rabbis would disagree with this psak, and that's why it's important to kind of address it and say maybe it's because he held like Rabbi Eliezer, but wouldn't necessarily be, that we would hold that way. Or maybe because he held that most of the people that were part of that unit of soldiers that came, in the case of Rav Dimi, which again you'd have to evaluate, what about the case here that they were dealing with, but it could be they were, the majority were Jews, that most of the soldiers of this unit were Jews, and therefore maybe. So now they're going to ask a question on the first explanation. Some of people get rid of the word ihachi, which makes sense. It doesn't really make sense to say ihachi here, because ihachi is usually, if so, like the last thing we just said, and this is referring to 2 sentences ago, the first suggestion that maybe holds like Rabbi Eliezer, Hai safek bia, safek magahu. Now, it's not safek bia here. We know they came. It's really an issue of safek maga. Did they touch it or not? Kevan de mefatre tuva, em adata de mamona patru, ukesafek bia dami. So the Gemara says, no. It is safek bia. It's not safek maga. Why? Because even though they opened a lot of barrels, it's still, going back to 2 stories ago, you could say that they came for money. As they were looking for money, they might not have been looking for wine. And therefore, it is like safek bia, because it's really a much less likely chance that when they came and opened all these barrels, they opened them to libate the wine. It's more likely they were looking for money. So he removes, that he basically says, even according to the first reason, there's likely reason to, and they've tried to say we didn't agree with the first reason. They said, no, it really is more like safek bia, not like safek maga. Okay, second story in this section. He masovita. There was and this is going to be our last story. There was a woman who worked in a wine store. It was a Jewish woman who worked in her own wine store, or was selling wines. She gives her keys to an idolater. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Elazar. Uvada have a Beit Midrash. This case like this happened in the Beit Midrash. Va'amru lo masra ela shmirat mafteach bilfad. She only gave her the key to watch. She didn't say, go into my store, do whatever you want in my store. She said, I want you just to watch my key. When I come back, I'll get my key from you. She never gave her permission to go into the store. And Abai is going to say, we have a precedent for this in a Mishnah. Amar Abai Afana Nami Tanina. We have a Mishnah just like this. Hamosir Maftecho La'ama Aretz. And now we're going to start this big comparison to Ama Aretz as relates to Tum and Tara, which is very similar. And we're going to see how similar. So our case is very simple. We're worried that an idolater came in contact with the wine and offered it up as a libation. When you're talking about Tum and Tara, let's say I keep all my stuff to make sure everything's tahor, everything stays in purity, right? It's harder to understand because we don't live in a time when people do this, but in those days, people tried to keep all their items pure, in a state of purity. Now, if you're living in a time like that, and there's Amei Haaretz, now Amei Haaretz aren't careful about impurity. We talked about this a lot. So, if, again, there's the same kind of concern. Are you concerned that they touched your property and made your vessels, your food, impure? So, in a context of that, which again is going to be a similar idea here, which is, Abai quotes a Mishnah in Tarot, Hamoser maftecho la'ama aretz. If you give your keys to an ama aretz, tarotav tehorot, lefi shalom aser lo ela shmirat maftech bavad. And that's really why he brought this, even though it's going to open a whole thing. But he brought this to say, just because you give your key to someone doesn't mean you give them rights to go into your house. You're just asking them, watch my key for me. Now, so now the Gemara says, the Abai says, what's the comparison? Hashja tarotav tehorot yenesech mebaya. If we're not worried about Tum and Tara, then we're clearly, in the case of giving keys, then we're clearly not worried about yayin nesech. This is an interesting line in of itself. What, we're more careful about Tum and Tara than we are about yayin nesech? So the Gemara asks exactly that. L'meimer de Tara d'alime mi yayin nesech? What, are we more strict with laws of Tum and Tara than we are with yayin nesech? Okay, I could throw it out as an open question. What do you think? Do you think we'd be more strict with Tum and Tara, more strict with yayin nesech? Right, I think we would intuitively say, right, nowadays we keep yayin nesech, we don't really keep Tum and Tara. We would think that was more strict. And the truth is they're both rabbinic, okay? But they kind of think, isn't yayin nesech more strict? To which they answer, no, yes, really, it is true. Tahara laws are stricter than yayin nesech. There are cases where we're strict in Tum and Tara and with an ama aretz touching your stuff and making it tameh, then we are with yayin nesech, and we're going to prove that right now by this machloket Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, and we're going to see Rav's position is the one that's important. He's going to be strict with Tum and Tara, and he's going to be lenient in the exact same case with yayin nesech, okay, in the comparable case. And that's where we're going to bring this machloket Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, which then we're going to delve into. So, de itmar, it was said, that's always an intro, almost always an intro to a machloket between amoraim. Chatzir shechalka b'mesifas. We have a joint courtyard between either ama aretz and a chaver, as we call them, someone who's careful about Tum and Tara and someone who's not. We have a joint courtyard, or a Jew and an idolater, and there's a low mechitza in between. That's a misifas. Dividing it up, my part, your part. Okay, but it's just a low divider in a really commonly owned courtyard. So, what's the concern? Is there a concern that the person on the other side is going to come over and touch my stuff? Can I put my stuff out and not worry? My wine or my, when it's the ama aretz, my vessels, my fruits. So I'm a Rav. Tarotav tmeot. We have to assume if I have stuff there in that open courtyard, whatever's there was touched by the ama aretz, and therefore is tameh. But I'm not worried that they offered my wine as a libation, and we're not strict in that case. So what does this prove? Exactly what we were trying to prove. That when Abai said about the Shmirat Maftech and learned it from the Taro case, and then said, if this is the way for Taro, then it's fine, for sure it's fine for yayin nesech. And that's basically exactly what we see here, because we're more strict with yayin nesech. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Av Taro Tav Torot. He thinks we're not worried about anything. Okay? He thinks no one's coming over to your side to touch your stuff. Okay? You have that little mechitza, that's enough. Now, what we're going to do is, until we get this, is going to bring us almost to the end of the sugya, then it's going to be as soon as the end of the sugya, and then we're going to have a little Mishnah to learn for the end of the daf. I have three difficulties. First on Rav, then on Rabbi Yochanan, then on Rav. It's a bit of a back and forth. Meitive. So again, Rav is the one who forbids. So the Tum and Tara. So now we're going to bring a bunch of sugyas of Tum and Tara. Hapnimit shel chaver b'chitzona shel ha'ma'aretz. It's very similar. We have an inner house and an outer house. Now the inner person, to get out of their house, has to pass through an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard. He has to pass from his courtyard to the neighbor's courtyard. But the outer one doesn't ever have to go to the inner one, right? Except it is within arm's reach, kind of like the courtyards, right? The courtyard before had this little barrier in between, right? It was one big courtyard with a barrier. This is two courtyards, one right next to the other. Perhaps there's not even a fence in between, okay? But one belongs to one and one belongs to the other. So it says here, if the pnimit is shel chaver, if the inner one is the one who's careful about Truma and Tara, and the chitzona is the Am Haaretz, the outer one is the Am Haaretz, oto chaver shotech sham perutav u'meniach sham kelim, v'af api. Okay, so the chaver can put out all their stuff and not worry about anything. Okay, they can put their fruits to dry. They can put, right, that's what they would do. They dry out their fruits. He can put his vessels. Even though it's within hand's reach of the Am Haaretz, when he's standing in his property, he could touch into the chatzar of the Jew, but it's not into the chatzar of the chaver, but it's not a problem. Kasha the Rav, right? Rav said, if the mifisifas case, you have to worry. All your stuff is tamei. So Amar l'charav shanihatam shenitfas alav kiganav. Now these are two different cases. The first case was join the own courtyard that we put up a little barrier. No one's going to bother the person if they go into the other side, or they won't get caught anyway as a thief. But if it's my inner house and someone comes into that's trespassing on my property. So what if they can reach into it? That's forbidden by law. That's my property. That's their property. Okay. Tashma. Difficulty now in Rabbi Yochanan, who actually permitted. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, so Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Gago shel chaver lamala mi gago shel Am Haaretz. Let's say we have two roofs. The roofs there, people would do stuff on the roof. They dry out their fruits. It was a good place to dry things. So the roofs are different levels, okay? And the higher one is the chaver, and the lower one is the Am Haaretz. Oto chaver shotech sham perutav meniach sham kelim. You can put all your stuff at the top there, not worry. Ubilvad, but as long as shelote yado shel Am Haaretz magad l'sham, if they have to be high enough that the Am Haaretz can't reach. Now why? Because if the Am Haaretz can reach, we're worried that the Am Haaretz came in contact with the stuff. That's not Rabbi Yochanan says we don't have to worry. If there's a misifas, we're not worried. Why are we worried there? To which they answer, Atzokasha Rabbi Yochanan, this raises a difficulty with him. Amar lecha Rabbi Yochanan shani hatam di'ilach lishtemute. If the Am Haaretz gets caught with their hands up there, they actually have an excuse. Now I want you to think about the difference between hand being going up, extending up, and hand extending over a mechitza and down onto the ground of the other neighbor. You can see the difference. So we're going to say here, Meimer Amar im tzure kami mitzrana. So there's different interpretations what this means with tzure and mitzrana. Metzer is a border. Rashi says maybe you could say, I was trying to measure the space here. Okay, that's why my arm was up there. Right? You can't say that if it's down in the property on the floor of the neighbor, but you can say that if you're up. Other commentaries, like if you look in the Koran, they say it was stretching. I was just stretching my arms and it happened to reach. Okay, so that's a different story, right? He has some sort of excuse. Again, you're not going to stretch your arm and bend it down into the neighbor's property. Okay, so that's the resolution. Next one, Tashma, Gagoshel Chaver B'tzad Gagoshel Am Haaretz. Here we have two roofs, one same level as the other. Oto Chaver Shotech Sham Perot Umeniach Sham Kelim. You can put your stuff out, Afal Pishi Adoshel Am Haaretz Magad L'Sham, even though the neighbor can get there and they're an Am Haaretz. Kasha the Rav, that's Rav, because Rav said when there's a barrier, you still have to worry. Of course, if there's two roofs next to each other, you have to worry. So Amar L'Charav, Lav Ikar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel D'Kai Kavatei, Ana Da'amri Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. I have Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel to hold by. Now, he obviously doesn't understand Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel the way we just explained it about the stretching. He says, and they were two roofs on different levels. He claims it would be the same. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was just talking about two roofs, this one next to that one, whether they're different levels or whether they're not. He didn't think that was an important issue. And that was the serious issue. And he says here, what does it say? If you have two roofs, as long as the one can't reach into the other, it's fine. But if one can reach into the other, it's a problem, and that's my opinion. So don't throw me a Tanaitic source. I could say, I hold like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and with that, resolve it. And I just don't hold like the Braita that you quoted me. Okay, with that, we'll finish with the Mishnah. Boleshet shenichneset la'il. If a boleshet is an army, a group of army soldiers that comes into the city, bishat shalom, if they come in a time of peace, a troop, thanks, that's a good word, troop comes in, bishat shalom, if it's a time of peace, all chaviyot ptuchot asurot, we're obviously talking about a non-Jewish troop, if any barrels that were open in the city, we assume that they came in and basically tampered with. But they're asurot. But stumot, well, not tamper with, but they didn't even have to tamper with them. That's probably not the best word, but they could have offered them up as a libation. But anything that's sealed, mutarot, unless we see that they were tampered with. Bishat milchama, it's very interesting, but in a time of war when they come into town, elu ve'elu mutarot lefi she'ein panai lenasech. Okay, they don't have time when they're in a time of war to start offering libations. Maybe they'll go drink some wine, but they're not going to offer libations, and therefore you're not worried about anything that they came in contact with, even the open ones. It's all the same idea about what's going on in their heads and what is therefore motivating. And that's really the review for today's daf, about all these cases where, again, if they're concerned that someone's going to catch them, if they're concerned someone even just is going to see them, if the Jew, him or herself, will see them, the owner, if they have rights to be in that area, there's all different kinds of considerations. Maybe it wasn't even idolaters, right? There's all different opinions, all different cases here that highlight all these issues about when we're going to be concerned with nesech and when we're not. And then from there we tangented it off a little bit to the Am Haaretz and the Tarot, and again, which situations are we concerned that they're going to do it? And we did see in the end that we are more strict with Tarot, interestingly enough, than we are with yayin nesech. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, and shenishma b'sorot tovot b'karov.